For most of human history, the people who lived here were invisible. Too far north, too isolated, too cold, too dark for half the year and too bright for the other half. A land that looked from the outside like a punishment, like somewhere the world had put its leftover rock and its leftover ice and decided to call it a country. And then, on a summer morning in 793 AD, they arrived on the coast of an English island called Lindisfarne. And the world discovered, with considerable violence, that it had been wrong about Norway. Today, that frozen edge of the world is the most admired country on Earth. First in human development, first in quality of life, first in the world for equality, for education, for the kind of happiness that is not just an emotion, but a system built deliberately, maintained carefully, and funded by one of the most audacious financial decisions any government has ever made. Norway has 5 million people. It owns 1% of every publicly listed company on Earth. Let that land for a moment. It is a country where the prison system is so humane that other nations send delegations to study it, where university is free, where parental leave lasts a year, where the wealth gap between the richest and poorest citizens is among the smallest in the developed world. And it is a country whose national identity was forged by people who wore helmets with ravens on them and terrorized the coastlines of 3 continents. Here is the question this documentary is going to ask, and it is going to take 45 minutes to answer properly. How does the harshest, most isolated, most inhospitable corner of Europe produce both the most feared warriors in medieval history and the happiest, most equal, most prosperous society on Earth today? The answer is not what you expect, and it starts not with a king, not with a battle, not with an oil well. It starts with ice. This isn't just a country, it's a 1,000-year experiment in survival. The Vikings didn't disappear, they just traded their longships for a sovereign wealth fund. Chapter 1. The architects of the fjord. Before the Vikings, before the kings, before the oil and the welfare state and the sovereign wealth fund, before any of it, the ice. Norway was buried under a glacier 2 kilometers thick until roughly 10,000 years ago. 2 kilometers. That is taller than most mountains in Britain. A sheet of ice so massive and so heavy that it pressed the land itself down into the Earth's crust. And Norway is still, 10,000 years later, slowly rising back up. Geologists call it post-glacial rebound. A country still recovering from the weight of its own past. When the glacier retreated, it did not leave gently. It carved. It gouged. It dragged boulders the size of houses across the landscape and left behind the most dramatic terrain in Europe. Mountains that drop straight into the sea. Valleys so deep they had to be flooded by the ocean just to become navigable. A coastline so fractured, so convoluted, so extraordinarily complex that if you stretched it into a straight line, it would wrap around the Earth twice. 50,000 islands, more than 200,000 lakes, 90% of the country covered by mountain, fjord or dense forest. The arable land that remains the flat, farmable ground where food can actually grow is a thin strip clinging to the coastline like a footnote. This is not a country that invites settlement. It demands adaptation. The fjords are the key to everything, and they are almost universally misunderstood, even by people who have seen them, photographed them, stood at the edge of them and felt something they could not name. A fjord is not simply a beautiful view, it is a wound, a scar left by a glacier that has been filled with seawater. The glacier carved downward, deeper and deeper into the bedrock, and when it retreated, the sea rushed in to fill the void. Sognfjord, the longest and deepest fjord in Norway, is 205 kilometers long. At its deepest point, it reaches 1,300 meters below the surface. That is deeper than the tallest building in the world is tall. But here is what makes fjords remarkable beyond their beauty. They are simultaneously the most dramatic and the most practical geographic feature in northern Europe. Natural harbours, protected from the open ocean by arms of rock on either side. Deep water channels that allow large vessels to navigate far inland. Highways into the interior of a country that has almost no roads and even less flat ground. The people who learn to read the fjords, to understand their currents, their depths, their tides, their seasonal moods, gained an advantage that would eventually terrify half the known world. The first people arrived in Norway approximately 10,000 years ago following the ice as it retreated northward, drawn by the extraordinary abundance of the newly revealed coastline. Fish, seabirds, marine mammals, a larder so rich that in summer it could sustain communities that would have starved anywhere else on the continent. But sustaining a community in Norway's summers is only half the challenge. The winters are the making of the Norwegian character. Above the Arctic Circle, and roughly a third of Norway sits above it, the sun does not rise at all for weeks in midwinter. Not low on the horizon, not briefly, not at all. The polar night, total darkness, for weeks on end. What this does to human psychology is profound and thoroughly documented. The desperate physical need for warmth and light and human contact. The way the darkness compresses time, flattens mood, and creates a biological urgency for connection that milder climates simply do not produce. The Norwegian response to the polar night is not to endure it stoically. It is to build against it, deliberately, culturally, architecturally, to create warmth from the inside out, to turn inward and find, in the darkness, a reason to be together. The Norwegians have a word for this, koselig. It translates roughly as coziness, but that translation misses the weight of it entirely. Koselig is not a feeling. It is a practice. Candles lit in the afternoon. Fires built not just for heat, but for the light they throw. Food shared slowly. Conversation that does not rush toward a point. A cultural insistence on the quality of small moments against the backdrop of an extreme world. It is, in its way, the most Viking thing about modern Norway. The refusal to be broken by conditions that should, by any reasonable measure, break you. And then there are the Northern Lights. The Norse called them the Bifrost, the burning rainbow bridge that connected the human world to Asgard, the realm of the gods. Warriors who died in battle were carried across it by the Valkyries. The lights were not decoration. They were infrastructure, proof that the world the Norse inhabited extended beyond what the eye could see, that there was something on the other side of the darkness worth fighting toward. That belief that the darkness is not the end but the threshold runs through Norwegian culture from the Viking age to the present day in ways that are not always visible but are always present. You see it in the architecture, designed to capture and hold whatever light the winter offers. You see it in the literature, which has a relationship with melancholy that is not depressive, but clarifying the darkness as a place where you find out what you actually are. And you see it most clearly in the Norwegian refusal to treat their extraordinary natural world as a backdrop to human life, rather than the central fact of it. Norway has more than 50,000 islands. Its coastline, at 63,000 kilometres, is longer than the distance around the Earth 1.5 times. The country stretches further north to south than the distance from Oslo to the Sahara Desert. It is, by almost any geographic measure, a country that should not work. And yet, the people who stayed were being shaped by a process they could not name. The land was selecting for specific qualities: endurance, resourcefulness, the ability to read nature with the precision of a surgeon. Generation after generation, the ones who chose to remain absorbed something from the landscape that the ones who left never acquired. A relationship between preparation and survival so instinctive, it stopped feeling like a choice. By the 8th century AD, the communities along the Norwegian coast had refined those qualities into something the world had never seen before. A technology so precisely engineered for its specific environment, the fjords, the open ocean, the rivers of foreign lands, that it would change the course of world history. The longship. But before we talk about what the longship did to the world, we need to understand what the world did to Norway to make the longship necessary. Because the Vikings did not appear from nowhere. They were not a random eruption of violence from a primitive people. They were the precise and logical product of a specific geography, a specific crisis, and a specific moment when the technology finally matched the ambition. June 8th, 793 AD. The monks of Lindisfarne are at morning prayer when the ships appear, low in the water, fast, moving with a purpose that has nothing to do with trade. What happens next is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in a single shaken sentence. The ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. It is the first major Viking raid. trade on record. And it doesn't just change England, it changes the temperature of the entire known world. From Ireland to Constantinople, from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North Africa, the word spreads. Something has come out of the north, something that the walls of monasteries and the prayers of monks cannot stop. For the next 2.5 centuries, that something will reshape the map of the world. But before we talk about the raids, we need to talk about the ship, because the Viking longship is not a weapon. It is a technology platform, the most sophisticated piece of maritime engineering on Earth in the year 793. And without understanding what it could do, you cannot understand how people from the fjords of Norway ended up everywhere. The hull is clinker-built, planks overlapping like the scales of a fish, riveted together with iron, then sealed with tarred rope. The result is a hull that flexes in open water rather than breaking. Where a rigid hull splinters under the stress of Atlantic waves, the longship bends, absorbs and survives. The draft, the depth below the waterline, is barely a metre. A ship carrying 60 warriors and their supplies can be sailed across the open Atlantic and then rowed directly up a shallow river without stopping, without unloading, without changing vessels. The same ship that crossed the ocean can be carried across a portage by its crew and launched into a river on the other side. And it is symmetric. Identical at both ends. It can be beached, unloaded and pushed back into the water stern first without turning around. In a raid, those seconds matter. This is not a boat designed for one purpose. It is a machine designed for every purpose simultaneously. Ocean crossing, river navigation, beach landing, fast retreat, cargo carrying, troop transport, the Swiss Army knife of the ancient world, built from Norwegian oak, shaped by 8,000 years of fjord navigation. The Vikings did not conquer the world because they were more violent than everyone else. They conquered it because they had a machine nobody else had. And they knew how to use it. The Norse language is embedded in English so deeply that most speakers never notice it. The words sky, window, knife, egg, husband, anger, and berserk are all Norse. So is the word they. One of the most commonly used words in the English language comes directly from Old Norse. The Vikings raided the monasteries of England. They also, quietly and permanently, rewired its language. A 9th century skald described the launch of a great ship this way. She went to the sea like something alive. The water took her the way the sea takes what belongs to it, without hesitation, without resistance, as if she had always been there and we had only just noticed. That feeling of people returning to something that was always theirs is the key to the Viking Age. They were not invaders from outside the world. They were the world's edges, finally moving. Because here is the thing that the word Viking obscures. The Norse people were not doing one thing. They were doing everything, everywhere at the same time. While the raiders were hitting the monasteries of England and Ireland, Norse traders were establishing the routes that would become the arteries of medieval European commerce. The Varangian routes down the rivers of Russia, through the Caspian Sea, all the way to the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad, were Norse highways. The Arabic silver that flooded into Scandinavia in the 9th and 10th centuries came from those routes. The Norse traders who ran them were not raiders. They were the medieval world's most ambitious merchants. While the traders were building their routes, Norse settlers were doing something even more extraordinary. They were colonizing the North Atlantic in open boats, navigating by stars and birds and the colour of the water, with no maps and no certainty of what lay ahead. Iceland was settled by Norse farmers beginning around 874 AD, a treeless volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic, 900 kilometres from the Norwegian coast. They built a society there, with a parliament, the Althing, established in 930 AD, one of the world's first democratic assemblies, on a rock in the ocean that had no strategic value whatsoever. They went because the land in Norway had run out, and they stayed because the Norse did not know how to leave. From Iceland, Eric the Red pushed further. Exiled for manslaughter, even Viking society had rules. He sailed west and found Greenland, named it deliberately, optimistically, misleadingly, and settled it. His son, Leif Erikson, went further still. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson lands on the coast of North America. The Norse sagas call it Vinland. Modern archaeology calls it Lons aux Meadows in northern Newfoundland, where the remains of a Norse settlement were excavated in the 1960s. Timber structures, iron nails, a bronze cloak pin of Norse design. The evidence is conclusive. 500 years before Columbus, Norwegians were standing on American soil. They did not stay. The indigenous people they called Skraelings outnumbered them, and without the supply lines that a permanent colony required, the settlement was abandoned. But they were there, 500 years before Columbus, on a continent the rest of the world did not know existed, found by people from Norwegian fjords who simply refused to believe that the ocean had an end. The edge of the world kept moving because the Norse could not stop pushing it. That is not exploration. That is a personality trait. They didn't navigate with fear, a modern Norwegian historian once said. They navigated with curiosity. The ocean was not an obstacle to the Norse, it was the road. And the road went everywhere. The Vikings who settled in northern France, given land by a desperate Frankish king who decided it was cheaper to pay them than to fight them, became the Normans. Their leader, Rollo, was a Norse chieftain from the fjords. His great-great-great-grandson was William the Conqueror. The Norman invasion of England in 1066, the most consequential military campaign in English history, the event that shaped the English language, the English legal system, and the English aristocracy, was led by the grandchildren of Norwegian settlers. The world we inherited was, in no small part, designed by people from Norwegian fjords. The Vikings who travelled east became the Varangian Guard, the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. Norse warriors standing watch over the wealthiest court in the medieval world, 10,000 kilometres from the fjords where they were born. The word Russia itself derives from the Norse word Rus, the name given to the Norse traders and warriors who established the first state centred on Kiev in the 9th century. The founding dynasty of medieval Russia was Norse, and yet, for all their reach, for all the distances they covered and the worlds they touched, the Norse brought something back with them every time. Not just silver and silk and slaves and stories, they brought back ideas. The Thing system, the Norse word for assembly, Thing was the political institution that governed Viking society. Free men meeting to settle disputes, make laws and hold their leaders accountable. It operated in Norway, in Iceland, in the Norse settlements across the North Atlantic. It is not a coincidence that the countries with the deepest Norse heritage, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, are also the countries with the oldest and most durable democratic traditions. The Althing of Iceland, established in 930, is the oldest continuously operating parliament on Earth. The Vikings did not just conquer the world, they took their politics with them wherever they went. And the politics they took were, by the standards of their time, remarkably egalitarian. By the 11th century, the Viking Age is ending. Not with a battle, not with a defeat, with a transformation. The Norse chieftains become Christian kings. The raids become trade routes. The longships become merchant vessels. Norway entered the medieval world as the Kingdom of Norway, a recognised Christian monarchy. Connected to the European world, it had spent 2 centuries terrifying. And then, slowly, it disappears. Not the land, not the people, but the story. The place Norway occupied in the world's imagination, and the descendants of those crews. They are still here. Start with Iceland, a volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic settled by Norse farmers in the 9th century, population 370,000. Small enough that most Icelanders can trace their family tree directly back to the original Viking settlers. Their language, Icelandic, is so close to the Old Norse the Vikings spoke that a modern Icelander can pick up a saga written 1,000 years ago and read it. Not study it, read it, the way you would read a newspaper. Their parliament, the Althing, was founded in 930 AD by Norse settlers who needed a way to settle disputes without killing each other. It is still sitting today. Over 1,000 years of continuous operation, the oldest active parliament on Earth, started by Vikings, still running. Their naming system has not changed in 12 centuries. A son of Eric is Eriksson. A daughter of Eric is Eriksdottir. Every Icelander carries their Viking ancestry in their name every single day. Beyond Iceland, Norse DNA runs quietly through millions of people who have no idea it is there. 6 million people in Britain alone carry significant Norse ancestry. The coastal towns the Vikings raided, settled, and eventually stayed in. They did not leave. They became the locals. The English language carries their fingerprints in almost every sentence. The legal systems of Northern Europe carry their politics. The democratic traditions of Scandinavia carry their thing assemblies. The Vikings did not vanish into history. They became the people writing it. What comes next is the part that nobody tells you. 4 centuries of silence, of plague and poverty, and political absorption of a people who had once terrified every coastline in the known world, reduced to fishermen and farmers at the edge of someone else's kingdom. But something survives the silence. Something that the darkness and the fjords and 8,000 years of endurance had built so deep into the Norwegian character that no king and no plague and no 400 years of Danish rule could touch it. To understand what that something is, you have to go back to the land. In the summer of 1349, a ship arrived in the harbour of Bergen. It had sailed from England. Its crew was sick. By the time anyone understood what they had brought with them, it was too late. The Black Death moved through Norway faster than almost anywhere else in Europe. Within 2 years, half the population was dead. Entire villages simply stopped existing. The farms in the high valleys were abandoned so suddenly that archaeologists centuries later would find tools still lying where they had been dropped. Meals left uneaten on tables, livestock wandering fields with no one left to tend them. In the Våga Valley in central Norway, archaeologists excavating an abandoned medieval farm found the remains of a meal still on the table. Bread, a wooden bowl, a spoon laid beside it as if its owner had stepped outside for a moment and would return. They never returned. The farm sat untouched for 200 years before anyone came back to claim the land. That is what the Black Death looked like in Norway. Not mass graves and city hospitals, silence, a spoon on a table, a fire that went out and was never relit. The nobility, already thin, already fragile, was effectively wiped out. The institutions that held the Norwegian kingdom together collapsed under the weight of a catastrophe that had no precedent and no remedy. And into that vacuum, Denmark stepped. What followed is the 400 years of Norwegian history that nobody outside Norway knows, the period that no documentary covers, the era that sits between the Viking Age and the oil fund like a long, uncomfortable silence in the middle of a conversation. From 1380 to 1814, Norway was, in practical terms, a Danish province. The Norwegian language was pushed out of official life, replaced by Danish in the courts, the churches, the schools, the administration. The Norwegian aristocracy that survived the plague was absorbed into the Danish nobility. Norwegian foreign policy was Danish foreign policy. Norwegian wars were Danish wars fought for Danish interests at Norwegian expense. For 400 years, Norway was someone else's country, and yet something survived. The stave churches are the most visible proof that Norwegian identity never fully died. Built without a single nail, the timbers slotted and pegged together with a joinery so precise that many of them have stood for 900 years. They carry on their rooflines the dragon heads of the Norse tradition. Inside, the Christian cross. Outside, the serpent, a people who converted to Christianity but kept their old symbols on the buildings as if hedging their bets. There are 28 stave churches left in Norway. There were once over 1,000. They survived because the communities around them refused to let them go, even when the official culture insisted they were obsolete, even when Danish administrators saw no reason to preserve them. A medieval Norwegian ballad, one of the few that survived the centuries intact, describes the experience of winter in a valley under Danish rule this way. The king is far. The snow is close. The mountain does not know his name. We keep the fire, we keep the song. We keep the thing that cannot be taken because it was never written down. That is not poetry. That is a survival strategy. And it worked. That is not a political statement, it is a geographical one. And it captures something essential about how Norwegian identity survived 4 centuries of Danish rule. The land kept its character even when the people were told to abandon theirs. And the people who lived in that land season after season, generation after generation, absorbed its stubbornness along with its beauty. In Bergen, something else was happening that would shape Norway's future in ways nobody anticipated. The Hanseatic League, the medieval trading network that dominated northern European commerce from the 13th to the 17th century, had established one of its most important offices there. The Briggen Wharf, with its distinctive wooden warehouse buildings painted in ochre and red, became one of the great trading hubs of the medieval world. German merchants controlled the trade. Norwegian fishermen supplied the cod. The relationship was exploitative. The Hanseatic traders set the prices, controlled the credit, and kept the Norwegian fishermen in a state of permanent debt. But it connected Norway to the wider European economy. It kept Bergen alive as a city of commercial sophistication, even as the rest of the country retreated into rural poverty. And it taught the Norwegians something that would prove useful later: how international trade works, how wealth moves, how a small country at the edge of the world can insert itself into global commerce and extract value from it. The lessons were bitter, but they were lessons. By the 18th century, Norway was poor, rural, and politically invisible. Its language barely existed in official form. Its culture survived only in the valleys and the fishing communities, passed from grandparent to grandchild in a language that had no official status and no literary tradition. And then Napoleon lost. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 transfers Norway from Denmark to Sweden. It is a transaction, a piece of territory changing hands between great powers, the way territories had always changed hands. Norway is furniture being moved from one room to another, except Norway refuses to behave like furniture. In the weeks between the announcement of the transfer and the actual handover, a group of Norwegian leaders meets at Eidsvoll, a manor house north of what would become Oslo, and does something extraordinary. They write a constitution in 6 weeks. One of the most liberal democratic constitutions in the world at that moment, drawing on Enlightenment principles, on the American Constitution, on the French revolutionary tradition, on the ancient Norse thing system. It establishes a Norwegian parliament, Norwegian laws, Norwegian sovereignty over Norwegian domestic affairs. It declares Norway a free, independent, and indivisible kingdom. And then Norway is handed to Sweden anyway, because in 1814, small countries do not get to decide their own fate based on what they write in 6 weeks. But, and this is the part that changes everything, Norway arrives in the Swedish Union with its constitution intact. The Swedes, who expected a territory, got a partner with a parliament. Who expected compliance, got negotiation. Who expected silence, got a country that had been practicing self-governance in its valleys and its fishing villages and its stave churches for 400 years, and was not about to stop. The Norwegian Constitution of 1814 is the oldest single document constitution still in force in Europe. It is older than most of the countries that consider themselves the founders of modern democracy. It was written by a people who had no political power, no military force, no economic leverage, only the conviction that the land they lived on and the identity that land had built in them was worth defending on paper, even when it couldn't be defended with weapons. For 91 years, Norway operated within the Swedish Union, keeping its parliament, its laws, its sense of itself, while the wider world paid no attention. But something was happening underneath the silence. Norwegian artists were excavating the buried national identity, one work at a time. Ibsen wrote plays that asked the questions Danish rule had forbidden. Grieg set the landscape to music. Munch painted the inner weather of a people who had spent centuries being overlooked. The anxiety, the isolation, the defiant aliveness beneath it all. The Scream is not a painting about madness. It is a painting about what it feels like to finally be heard. In 1905, Norway held a referendum on independence from Sweden. 99.9% voted yes. Sweden, to its considerable credit, let them go. Peacefully, without a war. Norway became a fully independent nation for the first time in 500 years. It was broke. It was rural. It had no empire, no colonies, no industrial base to speak of, and a population of just over 2 million people. What it had was a constitution, a parliament, a sense of itself that 400 years of Danish rule and 91 years of Swedish union had failed to extinguish, and a landscape that had been building the Norwegian character for 10,000 years. That was enough. For the first half of the 20th century, Norway was a respectable but unremarkable small European nation. It was occupied by Nazi Germany during the Second World War, a brutal 4-year occupation that the Norwegians resisted with a stubbornness that surprised the occupiers and did not surprise anyone who understood Norwegian history. The king fled to London and ran a government in exile. The resistance operated in the mountains and the forest, using the landscape as the Vikings had used the fjords, as cover, as advantage, as a weapon. After the war, Norway rebuilt, quietly, methodically, without drama. And then, on Christmas Eve, 1969, a drill bit hit something beneath the North Sea, and everything changed. Christmas Eve, 1969. A Phillips petroleum drill strikes oil in the Ekofisk field beneath the North Sea. The find is not modest. It is one of the largest offshore oil deposits ever discovered. The engineers on the platform know immediately that something extraordinary has happened. The well comes in so hard that it takes days to bring it under control. Norway, one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, has just discovered that it is sitting on a fortune. The question is not whether Norway is rich, but the question is what Norway does about it. To understand how remarkable Norway's answer was, you have to understand what usually happens when a poor country finds oil. Nigeria found oil, Venezuela found oil, Angola, Libya, Iraq, Equatorial Guinea all found oil. And in almost every case, the same thing happened. A resource curse so well documented that economists have a name for it. The oil money flows into the country faster than the institutions can handle it. Corruption takes hold. The currency inflates. Traditional industries collapse because they cannot compete with the artificial wealth. The gap between the elite who control the oil and the population who live above it grows into a chasm. Countries that were poor before the oil was found end up poorer in every way that matters. Inequality, instability in the quality of daily life for ordinary people, despite sitting on billions of dollars of extractable wealth. It is not inevitable, but it is almost universal. And now Norway looked at this pattern and made a decision that no other country in history has made at this scale. It decided the oil did not belong to the current generation of Norwegians. It belonged to all future generations of Norwegians. And it built a structure to protect that decision from the politicians who would inevitably want to spend the money now. The architecture of what Norway built is worth understanding in detail because the details are where the genius lives. First, Norway established that the petroleum resources beneath its continental shelf belonged to the Norwegian state, to the people collectively, not to private companies. Foreign oil companies could operate in Norwegian waters, but under strict terms with significant state participation and with the profits flowing to the Norwegian government rather than disappearing into offshore accounts. This was not obvious. It was a political choice contested at the time that required the Norwegian government to resist enormous pressure from international oil companies who wanted the same terms they had extracted from less organised governments elsewhere. Norway said, no, the oil is ours. You can help us get it out of the ground, but it belongs to us. Second, Norway created Statoil, a state oil company, to ensure that Norwegians themselves developed the technical expertise to manage their own resources. Rather than being permanently dependent on foreign companies, Norway trained its own engineers, built its own technical capacity, and gradually took control of its own extraction. Third, and this is the decision that separates Norway from every other oil-rich nation in history, in 1990, Norway created the Government Pension Fund Global, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and it established a rule so simple and so radical that it is worth stating plainly. Every krone of oil revenue goes into the fund. The government may spend only the returns on the investment, originally set at 4% annually, not the principal. The oil money itself is untouchable. It is invested globally in stocks and bonds and real estate across 70 countries, growing year by year, belonging not to the Norway of today, but to the Norway of 100 years from now. Today, that fund is worth over $1.7 trillion. It is the largest sovereign wealth fund in history. It owns approximately 1.5% of every publicly listed company on Earth. When you buy a coffee at a major chain, use a smartphone, board a commercial flight, there is a reasonable chance that a fraction of that transaction, invisibly, flows back to the Norwegian people. Every Norwegian citizen is, in effect, a shareholder in a fund worth over $300,000 per person. Norway is the only country in history to become a billionaire without losing its soul. But the soul question is the important one, because the money alone does not explain Norway. Plenty of countries have had money. The question is what you build with it. What Norway built with the security the fund provided is a social contract so comprehensive that it is difficult for people from outside it to fully believe. Healthcare is universal and free at the point of use. University education is free, not subsidized, not income dependent, free for every Norwegian citizen and for international students as well. Parental leave runs to almost a year, paid with a specific quota reserved for fathers to ensure that the burden of childcare does not fall entirely on mothers. The pension system is generous and reliable. The unemployment safety net is robust enough that losing a job does not mean losing your home. The result is a society where the gap between the highest and lowest earners is among the smallest on earth. Where social mobility, the ability of a child born poor to end up not poor, is higher than in the United States, higher than in Britain, higher than in almost any other developed country. Where the things that determine the quality of your life, your health, your education, your security in old age are not determined by how much money your parents had. This did not happen automatically. It was built deliberately over decades by governments of left and right who maintained a remarkable consensus that the oil money was a tool for building a society, not a prize to be distributed to whoever was in power. And underneath that consensus was something cultural, something that the Norwegians had a name for long before the oil arrived. It is called janteloven, the law of Jante. Janteloven is not a law in any legal sense. It is a cultural code, a set of unwritten rules that govern how Norwegians relate to each other and to the idea of success. It was first named by the Danish-Norwegian author Axel Sandemos in a 1933 novel, but he was describing something that already existed, something embedded in the Norse communal tradition, going back to the Thing assemblies of the Viking Age. The 10 laws of Jante, roughly translated, all say the same thing in different ways. You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you are better than anyone else. You are not to think you know more than anyone else. You are not to think you are more important than anyone else. In most cultures, this would sound like an instruction to mediocrity. In Norway, it functions as something more sophisticated. It is a social pressure against ostentation, against hierarchy, against the accumulation of status at the expense of community. It is the cultural antibody against the resource curse. When the oil money arrived, Janteloven was already there, quietly insisting that no Norwegian was entitled to more than any other Norwegian. That wealth was a communal resource, not a personal prize. That the Viking tradition of community survival, the longship crew pulling together or dying separately, was more important than individual accumulation. The oil fund is Janteloven applied to national finance. The money belongs to everyone. No one generation gets to spend it. No politician gets to claim it. It sits in the fund, growing, waiting for Norwegians who have not been born yet. There is a word in Norwegian economics for what Norway avoided. Hollandsk syke, Dutch disease. Named after the Netherlands, which found natural gas in the 1950s, spent the revenue immediately, and watched its manufacturing sector collapse as the currency inflated and traditional industries became uncompetitive. Norway studied the Dutch example and built its entire oil fund architecture specifically to prevent the same thing from happening. The fund keeps the oil money out of the Norwegian domestic economy. It is invested abroad in foreign companies, in foreign bonds, in foreign real estate. The returns, and only the returns, flow back into the Norwegian budget. This means the Norwegian economy is never flooded with oil money. The currency stays stable. Traditional industries stay competitive. The fishermen and the farmers and the manufacturers are not priced out of existence by the artificial wealth of the oil sector. It is an act of national self-discipline so rare it has no modern equivalent. Politicians who took in billions and chose not to touch it. Who built a structure specifically designed to protect the money from themselves. Who looked at the present and decided the future mattered more. In the entire history of democratic government, no country has done this at this scale. Norway did it quietly, without drama, and then went back to work. The Viking analogy is almost too neat, but it is accurate. The longship crew did not fight each other for the best seat. They each took their oar and pulled. The ship moved because everyone pulled together, or it did not move at all. Norway found oil and made the same calculation its ancestors made when they looked at the North Atlantic. The reward is real, the journey is long, and you do not get there by being impatient. Because here is the final, quietly extraordinary thing about Norway's relationship with its oil. Norway is already planning for the end of it. The country that built the world's largest sovereign wealth fund on oil revenue is simultaneously the world leader in transitioning away from oil. In 2023, over 80% of new cars sold in Norway were electric, the highest rate anywhere on Earth. The country that owns oil fields beneath the North Sea runs its domestic electricity grid almost entirely on hydropower. The fishing industry, the maritime sector, the government buildings, all moving systematically towards zero carbon. Norway found oil and saved the money for people not yet born. And it is now building a future for those people that does not depend on oil at all. That is not a coincidence. It is a policy. The same long-term thinking that created the fund is now driving the transition. The same cultural instinct that said the oil belongs to everyone said the climate belongs to everyone too. The Viking who crossed the Atlantic in an open boat did not know what he would find on the other side. He went anyway. Because the Norse relationship with the unknown has always been the same. You do not wait for certainty. You build the best ship you can. You read the water as well as you're able, and you go. Norway is going. There is a law in Norway that most countries would consider either utopian or incomprehensible. It is called allemannsretten, the right of all. And what it says in plain terms is this: every person has the right to walk, camp and move freely across any uncultivated land in Norway, including private land, regardless of who owns it. Not a right granted by permit. Not a privilege purchased with a park pass. A right. Constitutional in its weight. Ancient in its origin, so fundamental to Norwegian identity that when it was formally codified in 1957, it was not presented as a new law, but as the legal recognition of something that had always been true. In Norway, the land belongs to everyone who walks on it. This is not a recreational policy. It is a philosophical position, and it goes by a name that has no precise equivalent in English: friluftsliv, outdoor life. But that translation is too thin, too casual for what the word actually carries. Friluftsliv is not a hobby. It is not what Norwegians do on weekends when the weather is good. It is the organising principle of Norwegian existence, the belief, held at a level below conscious thought, that human beings belong outside. The interior life and the warmth, the conversation, the firelight is only fully real when it is set against the exterior world. That you cannot understand who you are until you have stood alone in weather that does not care about you. The philosopher Henrik Ibsen, who gave Norway its literary voice in the 19th century, described friluftsliv as the cure for what modern life does to the human spirit. He meant it as seriously as a doctor prescribing medicine. The outside is not optional. It is the treatment, and the landscape that Norway offers as the setting for this treatment is among the most extraordinary on Earth. The fjords first, because no description of Norway is honest if it does not spend time with the sheer physical scale of what a fjord actually is when you are inside one. Sognefjord is 205 kilometers long. Its walls rise over 1,000 meters in places. Its water is 1,300 meters deep at its lowest point. When you sail into it, and you should, and millions of people do every year, the scale does not hit you gradually. It hits you all at once like a physical thing. The walls close in. The sky becomes a strip. The sounds change. Your voice, if you speak, sounds different. The fjord absorbs it. Geirangerfjord is narrower, more dramatic, more immediately cinematic. The UNESCO-listed waterway where the walls press close and the waterfalls come off the plateau in long, white threads. It's at the same latitude as northern Alaska and central Greenland. The Gulf Stream, the Great Conveyor Belt, Lofoten Islands are simultaneously one of the most photographed places on Earth and one of the least understood. They are not a postcard. They are a living community, a working fishing culture, a place where the ancient economy of the sea still operates alongside the modern economy of tourism and the very modern economy of the sovereign wealth fund that underwrites Norwegian life from its headquarters in Oslo. Trolltunga, Troll's Tongue, is a piece of rock that juts horizontally from a cliff face, 700 metres above the Ringedalsvatnet Lake in western Norway. It is, objectively, an unreasonable thing to stand on. The hike to reach it takes 10 to 12 hours round trip. The weather can turn without warning. The exposure, 700 metres of nothing below your feet, is absolute. Approximately 80,000 people make the hike every year. This is Norwegians being Norwegian, not because it is easy, because it is not. The relationship between the Norwegian people and difficulty is worth understanding as a cultural fact rather than a personality quirk. The Norse tradition did not reward those who avoided hardship. It celebrated those who met it directly, without complaint, and kept moving. The word for this, the closest Norwegian equivalent, is pågangsmot. The courage to push forward, the willingness to keep going when the easier option is to stop. It is why the Constitution was written in 6 weeks. It is why the oil money was saved instead of spent. It is why 80,000 people hike 10 hours to stand on a rock above a 700-metre drop. And then there is the light. The Norse had a name for the Northern Lights. They called it the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that connected the human world to Asgard, the realm of the gods. The shimmering green and white curtains of light moving silently across the winter sky were not a meteorological phenomenon to the Vikings. They were the road the gods used to walk between worlds. Modern science explains the aurora as the collision of solar particles with atmospheric gases, producing light through ionization at altitudes of 100 to 300 kilometers. Both explanations are correct, and neither one fully captures what it is to stand in a Norwegian field in February, in minus 20 degrees, in complete silence, and watch the sky move. Above the Arctic Circle, the polar night runs from late November to late January. The sun does not rise. Not low on the horizon, it simply does not appear. For weeks, the only daylight is a pale blue glow on the southern horizon for a few hours around noon. The darkness is total, and it is long, and it does something to the human psyche that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. The Norwegian response to this darkness is not depression. It is architecture, not of buildings, but of atmosphere. The concept the Danes call hygge and the Norwegians practice with the same intuitive understanding, the deliberate construction of warmth, intimacy, and comfort as a counterweight to the darkness outside. Candles, fires, good food eaten slowly with people you have chosen to be near. The inside made warm enough that the outside becomes beautiful rather than threatening. It is the Viking longship principle applied to domestic life. You do not fight the darkness. You build something warm inside it. And then, because this is Norway, you go outside anyway. Cross-country skiing in Norway is not a sport. It is transport. It is the way ordinary Norwegians have moved through winter landscapes for 4,000 years. Archaeologists have found skis in Norwegian bogs dating to 3000 BC. Today, Norway has more cross-country ski trails than roads in some rural areas. Norwegian children learn to ski before they learn to ride a bicycle. The first Norwegian word a child learns for snow is not the general word. Norway has over 50 specific words for snow. Each one describes a different texture, a different condition, a different quality of white. Good snow, dangerous snow, snow that holds your weight, snow that doesn't. In Norway, the ability to read snow is not a skill, it is literacy. The Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of northern Scandinavia, Lapland in Norway, have been living this relationship with snow and reindeer and Arctic landscape for 10,000 years. Their culture, their language, their way of reading the land is the oldest continuous human tradition in Norway. Legally recognised now as an indigenous people with their own parliament, the Sami are the proof that the Norwegian landscape has been shaping human beings for longer than any written history records. And then there is Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago at 78 degrees north, where polar bears outnumber people and the sun does not set for 4 months in summer and does not rise for 4 months in winter, a place so remote and so extreme that the international treaty that governs it, the Svalbard Treaty of 1920, is one of the most unusual diplomatic documents in history, granting Norway sovereignty while guaranteeing the right of citizens of any signatory nation to live and work there. 3,000 people live in Longyearbyen, the main settlement. They do so by choice, in a place where you are legally required to carry a rifle when you leave the town boundaries because of the polar bears, where the permafrost means nothing can be buried, not pipes, not cables, not the dead, who must be transported to the mainland for burial because bodies do not decompose in the frozen ground, where the darkness and the light arrive in absolute, uncompromising blocks of months. Inside a mountain at Svalbard, something else is happening, something that is arguably the most important project Norway has ever undertaken. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Cut into the permafrost of the Svalbard mountain at a depth and temperature chosen specifically to preserve its contents without artificial refrigeration, even if all power fails. The seed vault holds over 1.3 million seed samples from nearly every country on Earth. It is a backup of the entire agricultural heritage of human civilization, every crop variety, every traditional seed, every genetic lineage of every plant that human beings have ever cultivated for food. It exists because Norway looked at the future and made the same calculation it made with the oil fund. The things that matter most, the things that belong to all of humanity, and not just to the current generation, need to be protected now by someone against every possible future. Norway volunteered, built the vault, maintains it, funds it, holds the seeds of the world's food supply in a mountain at 78 degrees north, available to any country that needs them, with no political conditions and no charge. It is Janteloven applied to global civilization. No one country's seeds are more important than any others. The vault holds them all equally, in the dark, in the cold, waiting. A 9th century skald described the northern lights this way. The gods ride across the sky on horses made of fire and cold. Their road is a road of colour that no man can walk, but every man can see it, and every man who sees it knows that what is above him is larger than what is below. 2,000 years later, standing outside the seed vault at Svalbard, watching the aurora move across the sky above a mountain that holds the agricultural heritage of all of humanity, you understand what the skald meant. What is above you is larger than what is below. Norway has always understood this. It is the thing the landscape taught the people who stayed. The thing the darkness confirmed. The thing the Viking crews knew in their bones when they pushed off from the fjord shore into the North Atlantic with no map and no certainty. You are small. The world is large. Go anyway. We began with a question. How does the harshest, most isolated, most inhospitable corner of Europe produce, in the same breath of history, both the most feared warriors the medieval world had ever seen and the happiest, most equal, most prosperous society on Earth today? We have spent 50 minutes building the answer. Now it is time to say it plainly. The answer is the same answer. It has always been the same answer. The land. Not the land as a resource, not the fish, not the timber, not the oil beneath the North Sea. The land as a teacher, as the thing that shaped the people who stayed inside it season after season, generation after generation, until the landscape's logic became the people's logic. The fjords taught the Norse people to build ships that could go anywhere because the fjords themselves went everywhere, into the heart of the land, out to the open sea, connecting what seemed unconnectable. The longship is a fjord made mobile, a Norwegian geography set to sail. The darkness taught the Norwegians to build warmth from the inside out, not to fight the polar night, but to construct something, a fire, a community, a social contract that made the darkness beautiful rather than defeating. The welfare state is a hygge writ large, a nation deciding together that nobody should sit alone in the cold. The harshness taught the people pågangsmot, the courage to push forward. The constitution written in 6 weeks by people with no power. The oil money saved for people not yet born. The seed vault dug into a mountain for a future nobody can predict. All of it the same instinct. Keep going. Build something that lasts. The journey is longer than you are. And Janteloven, the quiet, stubborn insistence that no one is more important than anyone else, held the whole thing together. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because Janteloven is the piece of Norway that the outside world finds hardest to believe. In a country where every citizen is theoretically a millionaire on paper, where the sovereign wealth fund makes Norway one of the wealthiest nations in history, the social pressure against displaying that wealth is so strong that ostentation is genuinely embarrassing. Norwegians do not drive cars that announce their income. They do not build houses that dwarf their neighbours. They do not talk about money. The cultural antibody against excess that Sandemos named in 1933 was not created by the oil. It was already there, in the Viking longship crew that pulled together or drowned separately, in the peasant communities that survived the Danish centuries by refusing to let any one family claim more than its share of the thin coastal farmland in the Constitutional Assembly at Eidsvoll, where men with nothing decided that what they built would belong to everyone equally. Janteloven did not make Norway rich. It made Norway keep its wealth honestly. And that is a much rarer achievement. Kept the oil money from becoming a prize for the powerful, kept the welfare state from being dismantled by those who no longer needed it, kept the Norwegian conversation about the future honest, because in a society where nobody is allowed to think they are exceptional, the exceptional things get built collectively or not at all. The Vikings understood this before anyone named it. A longship crew that fights over the oars drowns. A longship crew that pulls together reaches America. The choice has always been that simple. And Norway has always in the end made the same choice. Norway is not a miracle. Miracles are accidents. Norway is a decision made over and over again by generation after generation of people who looked at a land that offered them almost nothing and decided that almost nothing was enough to build everything. It is a country that produced the Vikings not despite its harshness, but because of it. That survived 4 centuries of invisibility by holding its identity in the stave churches and the folk ballads, and the language that refused to die. That found oil and did something no other country has done, saved it. That built a society so equal, so educated, so free that it consistently leads the world in human development, in happiness, in the quality of ordinary daily life. And that is quietly, methodically, without drama or announcement, already building the world that comes after oil. The 9th century skald who described the launch of a great ship, who wrote that the water took her the way the sea takes what belongs to it, without hesitation, without resistance, was describing something larger than a single vessel. He was describing a people's relationship with the unknown. The Norse looked at the narrow gate and did not see a limit. They saw a starting point. Every longship that pushed off from a Norwegian fjord shore was answering the same question the gate posed. What is on the other side? The answer, it turned out, was everything. America, Russia, Constantinople, the medieval trading world, the modern welfare state, the largest sovereign wealth fund in history, the seeds of the world's food kept safe in a mountain at the top of the earth. All of it reached through the same narrow gate. All of it built by the same people, all of it rooted in the same cold, dark, impossibly beautiful landscape that made them what they are. Norway looked at the edge of the world and built a civilization on it. The question the rest of the world is still trying to answer is a simple one. What took us so long to notice? Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, worth over $1.7 trillion. It was built on oil. It is invested in the future. It belongs to Norwegians not yet born. The Vikings didn't disappear. They just found a new way to conquer the world.